Well, good morning again. We'll do a little lesson here. Um, we'll start in Psalms 118, working to try to come up with some options for uh, Sunday school books as far as for the teachers to share. Um, Reached out to a couple of places trying to see where they're at. Try to have uh, a bit of a lesson plan. So we'll see how that goes. As we're looking at some of the other different options to see what they were. So we'll see how we are on that as they come along. Sometimes it's trying to reach out and get the information for some of the different ones is run a little slower than what I thought it would be, but we'll see where we're at. Psalms 18 is where we'll read. Now, this, of course, is as many of the Psalms are very familiar, and David writing from his place. Uh, so there, again, often we start reading the Psalms and forget to read the part above it. Often, when we look at Psalms, you can see through at the top of your Bible. There's often a little notation on top of the Psalm, and I've talked about those in the past. But you'll look through, you'll see who the Psalm was written by, but many times it'll tell you when this Psalm was written, and it gives you some of the context for this particular song or psalm that was written by David, or small devotional, or ever how you want to say that David was writing this. As he was writing it in the beginning of Psalms 18 and verse 1 is to the chief musician, a psalm of David, the servant of the Lord, who spake unto the Lord the words of the song the day that the Lord delivered him from the hand of all his enemies and from the hand of Saul. And he said, I will love thee, O Lord, my strength. The Lord is my rock and my fortress, Psalms 18 and 2. The Lord is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer, my God, my strength in whom I will trust, my buckler and the horn of my salvation and my high tower. I'll call upon the Lord, who is worthy to be praised. So shall I be saved from mine enemies. Now, there's a lot of different things here that David's talking about. And if we look through those first few verses, we'll come back to those. But let's read on a little bit more. In verse 3, I will call upon the Lord who is worthy to be praised. So shall I be saved from mine enemies. Verse 4, Psalms 18 and 4, the sorrows of death compassed me, and the floods of ungodly men made me afraid. The sorrows of hell compassed me about. The snares of death prevented me. In my distress, I called upon the Lord and cried unto my God. And he heard my voice out of his temple, and my cry came before him, even unto his ears. Then the earth shook and trembled. The foundation also of the hills moved and were shaken, because he was wroth. There went up a smoke out of his nostrils, and a fire out of his mouth devoured. Coals were kindled by it. He bowed the heavens also, and came down, and darkness was under his feet. And he rode upon a cherub, and did fly, yea, he did fly upon the wings of the wind. He made darkness his secret place. His pavilion round about him were dark waters and thick clouds of the skies. So the brightness that was before him, his thick clouds passed. Hailstones and coals of fire. Yea, he sent out his arrows and scattered them. He shot out lightnings and discomfited them. Then the channels of waters were seen. The foundations of the world were discovered at thy rebuke. He sent from above. He took me and drew out many waters. He delivered from my strong enemy and from them that hated me, for they were too strong for me. They prevented me in the day of my calamity, but the Lord was my stay. He brought me also into a large place. He delivered me, and he delighted in me. And the psalm goes on, but we'll look primarily at these here now. Going back to that very top, we were talking about, to the chief musician, a psalm of David, the servant of the Lord, who spake unto the Lord the words of this song in the day that the Lord delivered him from the hand of all his enemies and from the hand of Saul. So David's mindset when he's writing this, first of all, we see in probably more detail on this Psalms that we get about where David was, who this was to. We get a really good idea of David's mindset. The time frame that David writes this is early in his life. He's been delivered from the hand of all his enemies. So this was not a psalm written while he was king. This was not a psalm that was written while he was a shepherd. This is in that time frame in David's life where he had been in a place of where past David. If you look through the Bible, it's 1 Samuel 16 or so. David's playing the harp for David, and then it's I can't remember if it's 16 is where Goliath is. So we have the battle of Goliath, and then kind of life goes into an ebb, and David is doing all this, and then he becomes the enemy of Saul and begins to gather up men around him, and he begins to have the mighty men come and form an army with David as he's kind of off in the wilderness, off to the side, possibly where exactly he's at, but this is the mindset that he is. Saul is chasing him through the wilderness. There's the stories of David hiding in the cave, and then Saul coming and being there in the cave, and David cutting a piece of his garment and slipping out, and then those stories are happening, and this is apparently just past that. So we see the mindset of where David is he's been troubled, he's been run, he's been chased, he's been scattered through the countryside. He's in a place of what's to do, where to go, and how he's in a place that he has this small band of men that are with him. I say small, using that term quite loosely, in the size of armies. He had hundreds of men that were with him, and with these hundreds of men were their families, was the other people that support a small army. There's this whole group of things that David has to worry about as he tries to find them safety, as he tries to find them peace, as he's chased by the nation that's his nation. His home nation has kind of chased him out into the borderlands, and he's in the place, if you read through the stories, where he's partially he slips over to become a Philistine, but that's a little bit of place that he finds some safety, and he acts as a personal guard for one of the Philistine lords, and he's in a place that he's just in a lot of turmoil. He can't go home, because if he goes home, then Saul will know where to look for him, and he endangers his own family. So he stays on the run with his family, with his friends, with the people that fight with him. David stays on the run at this time frame. And here we are. That's where we're at in this mindset in David's life. This is where we're at. If we can kind of catch that picture when we look at this Psalms 118, as David is sitting down and he's past the point, whatever's happened, David, he writes this as a praise to the Lord. The words of the song were written unto the Lord. So David is writing a hymn of praise. David is writing a hymn of thanksgiving. David is writing a hymn of this is what happened. He's documenting the story in this own unique way. He's documenting this place. He's writing this down for effort of praise, but also to understand where he's at. And as he documents his thoughts, he says, and this is the day, whatever happened on this day, that the Lord delivered him from the hand of all his enemies and from the hand of Saul. So we're at a place that there's been a lot of trouble. There's been a lot of work. There's been a lot of confusion. There's been a lot of worry. There's been a lot of doubt. There's been a lot of doing. There's been a lot of going. There's been a lot of running and a lot of hiding in David's life. And he sits down and he writes this psalm. So when we look at this psalm, we can look at it and say, this is what's going on. And I like that about this psalm is because we can see what's going on. And here's what's written. I love thee, O Lord, my strength. The Lord is my rock, my fortress, and my deliverer, my God, my strength in whom I will trust, my buckler, the horn of my salvation, and my high tower. So we look at a couple of different things now. And so I want to look there at verse 2, and it says, He's my fortress and my high tower. Now, if we can understand also, we're in David's time frame, we're in David's time of life. And so we understand that forts are different than where they were now, than what we see a fort. David saw a fort very differently than where we were at. The most likely, the archaeological dig of Ziklag was what is called a tell, a Tell. That's a city on a high hill. They would form these high berms and use these high points and build these cities on top of them. If we look in David's life particularly, it's Ziklag where he was at for a while. Maybe he was living there when he writes this psalm, as he's kind of escaped from Saul, and he's got away from Saul, and he's in a place of safety. He's in a place of security. Maybe he's at Ziklag when he writes this. We don't know. We can make some assumptions. We don't even accurately know 100% where Ziklag is. There's one town that they think is most likely where it's at, but this was a fortress walled town, using some assumption and some historical basis of this. This is a fortress walled town. You entered into the town. There was high towers on both sides of the entry. That classic look of, we would think, if we think of castle, maybe that's what you think of. And so they would build these with a single entry gate. And it's really only the one place to go into this high city, and it was a way to keep the enemy from in an attack. They were consolidated to one place. That classic castle look, and there's a high tower on one side and a high tower on the other. There was these fortress that maybe David was living in Ziklag when he writes this, and so he's writing this from this place of security. When he says, "I think about what God has done for me. He's been my fortress and my high tower." And so we can understand the necessities of these in David's life. David writes quite a bit about different, and uses the analogy of God being a fortress and being a place of safety, because in David's life he understood the need for these. He understood the need of these, and we can look at these examples from the Psalms and we can understand this. So David, when he becomes king, if we fast forward a little bit in David's life, when David becomes king, he spends a lot of money making these types of positions throughout Israel. He makes a lot of walled cities. He makes a lot of fortresses. He spends a considerable amount of time and amount of funds building up these type of places, because he understands the value of them. To an invading army, there's a significant difference. If you're going in, and again, trying to historically set our mindset to where David was at, you're in a place that there's lots of little countries around them that they like to take turns invading. It seems like they kind of come in, and then there's several bigger countries that we can see that kind of come in and invade the whole area. There's several. We see the Philistines were often, oddly enough, when I was talking about this. We were talking about the Philistines and David. I mean, you see that David was an Israelite and the Philistines were the enemy, but David's also at some point in time over by the Philistines fighting a different war. It's kind of like a three-part play to get all the moving pieces about who's going where, and you almost have to draw it out on a whiteboard sometimes to keep it straight when you're teaching it. But we had the Philistines that would come in and invade periodically, and then you had other small armies that would come in and invade. So if you lived out on the frontier, you didn't have a whole lot of safety unless you were in this place of fortress. You wanted these safe places. You wanted this place to run to. You wanted this place to be and have a place to go. And David writes this psalm from a place of safety. And we can see where he had been in some places. We can see where he had some experiences. When we look at the very beginning of the psalm, we kind of walk our way through this when we see this is what it is. And he says in verse 4, "The sorrows of death compassed me, and the floods of ungodly men made me afraid. The sorrows of hell compassed me about. The snares of death prevented me. In my distress I cried unto the Lord and cried unto my God, and he heard my voice out of his temple." So David says, this is where I was at. This is what was going on. There was a time that I was out in a place that of not safety. I was not in that place, but yet something happened. The Lord showed up and took over. And there was a place that happened then. And in verse 7 starts out, "Then the earth shook and trembled, the foundations also of the hills moved and were shaken because he was wroth. David said, I was in a place of not being secure. I was in a place of not having what I needed. I was in a place of maybe confusion. I was in a place of running. I was in a place of hiding. I was in a place of not knowing what was going on. I was doing the best I could. I was doing everything I knew to do. I was trying to be the person that I needed to be. And if you can remember that David had this time in his life where he had been a little shepherd boy out on the fields, and the prophet Samuel, and it's very difficult in just a brief few seconds to really put the understanding on who the prophet, the priest, the mediator, the judge of who Samuel was. He's the last of the judges, the first of the prophets, the one that's kind of crosses over between one to the other. If we can understand who Samuel was, it's very difficult to pass through how important Samuel is in the history of Israel, as we often he's kind of there, but Samuel shows up at his dad's house, at his dad's farm, at the place there, and says, "Hey, I'm here to anoint one of your sons as the next king." And they get all David's brothers there, and Samuel says, "Do you not have another son? This isn't one of them." And then it's, "Oh, well, there is this other guy who's out on the field," and they go get David from caring for the sheep and bring him in, and David's anointed, and then goes back to life as it had been before. But David has this call on his life that he's called out to, and he's trying to fulfill that call, realizing that there's a lot of moving pieces and there's a lot going on. He's been called as the next king, but yet there's a whole lot of other things that are still happening. And so David's going through this time of turmoil. David's going through this time of confusion, if you allow me to say it that way, in his life. And we can see that in the Psalms here, where he talks about the sorrows. But then he says something happens. I cried out unto the Lord, and smoke comes out of his nostrils, and he rides upon a cherub, and then he did fly, and he makes darkness his secret place, and the brightness that was before him as thick clouds past. And then David says, in a sense, he's writing a story and saying, this is what it felt like happened. Now, in the story of David, we of course don't see these things happening, so we realize this is an allegory in David's life. He says, from my standpoint, this is what I saw happen. The brightness is before him as thick clouds passed, hailstones and coals of fire. The Lord thundered in the heavens. He gave his loud voice, hailstones and coals of fire. Yea, he sent out arrows and scattered them. He shot out lightnings and discomfited them. And channels of waters are seen, and the fountains of the world were discovered by thy rebuke, and at the blast of the breast of his nostrils. And he sent from above, he took me and drew me out of many waters. He delivered me from my strong enemy and from them that hated me, for they were too strong for me. They prevented me in the day of my calamity. The Lord was my stay. He brought me also out into a large place. He delivered me because he delighted in me. David said that's what it felt like when it happened in my life. David said, he's writing this story and said, that's the relief that I had. If you read through the story that Samuel, or that Saul is chasing David through the wilderness over and over and round and around and about as they're running through the mountains trying to escape. Not that David was trying to fight. He was trying to get away from a fight, but yet something happens, and there's at some point in the story that Saul quits chasing David. And David gets some relief. And this is where David's writing this. And he's writing this from a place of safety and a place of security. And so we're in this place that he's talking about the fortress. He's talking about this high tower. And if we look at these from a historical standpoint, there are many things are different historically. We can look at probably the most famous fort, I guess, locally, if you want to use that term very, very loosely. We don't have any large forts in our area that you can go to. There's a few small wooden frontier forts if you're into such things that are a little more local. You've got a small fort down in Tallahassee that was a small wooden palisade fort that's there. But when we think of the big forts, likely the one that comes to your mind is the one in St. Augustine, the Fort Castillo de San Marco. The other fort that would be close to here, I guess of any size, would be Fort Pulaski in Savannah. There's maybe some others for those that are a little more of a history buff than I am. But But when we think of forts, this is often what we think about in our American standpoint. When we think of it, sometimes that's the term that we use. When he says that he's my fortress and my high tower, we can see these. And we can see, and again, looking from David's standpoint, this is a time of well before any gunpowder was introduced. I mean, the strongest weapon that you had was sword, spear, and arrows. So you made fortresses that were able to withstand against that. So very high walls to overcome the arch of the arrow, to make it difficult for the enemy to be able to bring arrows, and they would have to get a lot closer to you to be able to get the height to get to the top of the wall to be any difficult to you. And when they got to the close enough to shoot arrows at you, they were well within your arrow range to shoot arrows back at them, which is what you wanted. Now, until the advent of cannons, this is how forts were built. Very high walls, typically fairly thin walls, but very high. Now, of course, once cannons come along, they realized that wasn't the best thing to do. So then you have the design, much like we're familiar with the fort in St. Augustine. And that lasted for a while until the Civil War, and you had rifled cannons and much more powerful cannons, and that didn't work out so well. And that's when if you know the story of Fort Pulaski, that's kind of didn't take very long for cannons to kind of overcome the fort overall. For this design of fort, for them to realize that it had to be designed different. And then as history marches on and artillery becomes stronger and stronger, then essentially forts have went the way of the dodo bird. You now don't really have forts at all. Forts just something that we use in the term as we think of Fort Stewart and such now. Those are just the name of army bases that are held historically on. We had visited a fort recently, and it had been a real high, tall fort. And then World War I think it was, they knocked several stories off the fort and just made it basically for nothing else besides a gun platform for modern artillery that you don't see, even really see who you're shooting at, besides way off in the distance. The range of the guns had gotten out to the point that you use spotters and you're basically shooting at things that you can't see. So time certainly has moved on, but in David's time and the pre-modern artillery, I mean, the fort was the place to be. I'd visited, living there in St. Augustine many times. I'd visited the fort in St. Augustine. I was an unofficial tour guide. I could take you to all the places and say all the things, and knew all the places to hide behind walls and scare random people that didn't know that you were there. Had one particular door that was always fun. Everybody thought it was a closed door, but it was only closed because I closed it. So they'd come and stick their little head up to the window to look into the dark room, not realizing that I was on the inside of the room. Lots of fun if you're a juvenile kid, young boy. Here we are. When I think about visiting the fort, I think about the times that you were there, and I think about how the fort was designed, and the town was right there beside it. And it was this place of security, this place of safety, this place to go into when it was safe. And you wanted to make sure that the enemy comes, and it's historically, we think of this, the enemy comes and sneaks up on you, and you wake up and the ships are, you're being attacked. But in reality, it happened much different. The lookout would look out, and because that's what lookouts do, is they look out. And they would stand in the tower, and he would look to see an enemy ship coming, and here comes the enemy. And they said, the next thing they said was, well, let's go to breakfast, because you had hours and hours and hours before the enemy showed up. So the people would come out of the town, and you'd grab your valuables, clutch your pearls, and run for the fort. Because inside the fort was where you wanted to be. That was where safety was. That was where the provisions were. That was where the well was. That was where the armaments were. That's where everything was stored inside that fort. And David understood this, that the fortress was the place to live. And there are so many times when we think about that, and I begin to think about the fort, and begin to think about the battle, and you think about the cannons coming in off the enemy ships for the fort there in St. Augustine. You'd look at that, but think of the large-scale medieval battles, or the battles in David's time frame, as he's standing in a fortress, and the enemy comes in waves, and they break over and over on the walls of this fortress. David says, I understand when I say that the Lord is my rock, my fortress, my deliverer, my God, my strength in whom I will trust. He's my buckler, the horn of my salvation, and my high tower. He is my defense, but he's not also my defense, but he's my weapon of offense. And so David says there's this place that you are that you can get to in the times of your trouble, in the times of your struggle, in the times of your worry, in the times of your angst. There's this place that you can get to when you cry out to the Lord, that he becomes your fortress and your high tower. But the place not to be, is just on the outside. As I look at the fort, as I think about the battle, you can think the place that not to be is just on the outside, not just adjacent, not just close, but not like similar, just on the outside. And so many times, if we're not careful, that's where we want to stay. The Lord is there to be our help, to be our fortress, to be our deliverer. But so many times, if we're not careful, we want to stay just on the outside of the fort, just on the outside of the walls. And that's the most dangerous place to be, as I've said before. It's the most dangerous place to be in the middle of a battle, is just on the outside of the wall. So many times, if we're not careful, we'll live our life that we're just on the outside of God's will, just close, just adjacent, just proximate to where God wants us to be, is we're just right out there. But when you're just right out there, you're just right outside of the protection. You're just right outside where God wants you to be, and where that peace, that protection is. You want to live close. We want to live close. We want to live very similar to where we're at. And we want to be in that place that I want to be close enough, but I don't want to be too close. I want to be somewhat there, but not too close. David says in Psalm 61, from the end of the earth I will cry unto thee when my heart is overwhelmed. Lead me to the rock that is higher and nigh, for thou hast been a shelter to me and a strong tower from mine enemy. David says there's a time when we cry for help, that we run to him. And he understood that's what you do. You run into that fortress. You find that security. You have that safe place set. You have that place that you can go to in the middle of troubles, in the middle of trials, in the middle of all the things that are going on. We want that place that we can get to, that he can be our rock. He can be our fortress. He can be our deliverer. And my refuge in the day of affliction is how Jeremiah puts it. Living a life of similarity when we just want to be just close enough. I just want to be very similar to what God wants me to be. I want to be very similar to where he wants me to live. I want to live a life very similar to how I'm supposed to live. So I'm really close to the protection, but I'm not there. But be careful, that's the most dangerous place to be, because that's where all the enemy's artillery, all the enemy's arrows are pointed at. That was the worst place to be in the battle, is just on the other side of the wall, just on the outside of the fortress, because that's where all the action is. And that's where all the fighting is. That's where all the enemy's weaponry are pointed toward. Everybody tries to attack that place. And if we just live in a place that's almost and close enough and maybe good enough, I think I am, or I'm almost there. We're not careful, we're in that place of most confusion, that place of most danger, that place of least safety is in that place of almost. And if we're not careful, if we live in a place of almost doing the right thing, almost serving God the way that he wants me to do, almost being in a place that God's called me to be, I'm trying, and I'm not going against any of that. All of us, we understand what I'm saying, but when we purposely live in a place of almost, I think I'm good enough, I'm just going to stop here. No, the job's not quite done yet. You need to finish. You need to work a little bit harder. I'm happy where I'm at. I think I'm okay where I'm at. I think I'm doing good enough. And if we live in that place of almost good enough, then we live in a place of the most danger, the place of the place that the enemy spends the most time attacking is the ones that are almost there. And don't worry about the ones that are way out. I got time to get to them, but the ones that are almost into safety, that's the one that I want to get. That's the one that I'm shooting toward. I'm trying to get to the wall. I'm trying to get there before the gate closes. I'm trying to get there before they drop the portcullis, before they bring up the drawbridge. The enemy tries to get to that place and to get there. And if we live in that place of almost, if we live in that place of just about there, I'm almost there. I'm good enough. I'm happy where I am. I know God wants me to do a little bit more. I know God wants me to tighten up on these spots, but I think I'm okay where I'm at. And if we live in that place of almost, we're in the place of least security. We're in the place of least safety, that we're there. Daniel tells about a prophecy. When there's research of this, there's a prophecy in Daniel when he talks about a king that stumbles as he's running back to his fort and is lost. We should be careful not to be that person. Spiritually, we should live our life in a place that we are in His hand and in His will. When the storms do come, we are safe and secure. We need to live in that place that we know that He is our safety, but also more than just know, but live in that place of safety. Everybody knows the fort's the safe place to be. Everybody knows this is where that we're supposed to be in the times of trouble and the times of the enemy attacking. Everybody knows that we're supposed to be in the fort, but there's people that don't want to live in that constrained rules, or I just can't be constrained by all those rules that you have to live by. That's just legalism. That's just where it is. And so I don't want to live in that. I don't want to live in that way. All those things. I don't think that you have to live that way. I don't think that that's what you have to do. I really don't think it's that serious. I really don't think it's that tight. Well, you can think that way, and you don't want to live within the rules, but it also means that you're not living within the fort, that you're not in that place of safety, that you're not in that place of security. Now, when you read through the historical, accounts of this, and not to be, not to say, but if you live within the fort, you live within the rules. The post-Civil War modern era was the time that we used forts the most. Probably the last great hurrah of the typical fort, and using this is probably out west, and with the Indian wars of where fighting the Indians. You can always think about they had the forts there. They went back often to the wooden palisade style forts. You were not fighting an enemy that there was a large coastal defense, that you weren't worried about the enemy rolling up in large ships with cannons on them. And so you were fighting people that were still bows and arrows and sticks. So you had a lot of these. You had a lot of forts that were built, and that was the place that you wanted to be in the enemy attack. When the enemy was coming in, you went to the fort. But when you was inside the fort, you lived under army rules, and you were there where the army wanted you to be. And if you didn't want to live under the rules, you're welcome to leave the fort. But when you left the fort, you left the protection. Such as it is in our lives, such as it is, if we're not careful, we don't want to live in a place of rules, and we find people that don't want to live in those place of rules, and they don't want to live in that. And so spiritually, as I'm talking about spiritually, they don't want to be. They don't want to be in a place of being in submission. They don't want to be in a place of listening to the rules. I want to do it my own way. Well, if you want to do it your own way, you can't live in the fort. You can't be inside the fort and do things your own way. You don't get to make the rules and live inside the fort at the same time. You get to make the rules and live out on the wild frontier in the place of least safety. And the first one that gets scalped by the Indians is the guy that's living out by his own rules, living out his best life out on the frontier. He's the first one that loses his scalp when the Indians show up. And so we have to understand that sometimes the rules have a purpose, and sometimes we have to live within the rules. If you're going to live inside the fort, you have to live inside the rules. And so there's a reason sometimes people get away from the rules, as it were, of Christianity, of holiness, of living a life that's, as I said before, this is legalism. This is what this is. No, this is a life of safety. This is a life of security. This is a place that I know I'm where God wants me to be. Why do I live this life? Because I'm trying to live under the will of God. Because what I need for Him is I need for Him to be my fortress. I need for Him to be my provision. I need for Him to be my safety. And if that means I have to live under His rules to live there, such as it is, I'll live under His rules to be there. That's where I want to live. Spiritually, that's where I want to be. I want to live within the rules. Sure, there's some binds and there's some confines and there's some things that have to do, because the Bible has always put it this way. God has always put it this way, written down in our Bible. We can read through these. God has always had a time of, if you will, I will. This has been from the very beginning. The covenant that He has with Adam and Eve starts out this way. When they break the covenant, they lose the protection. from the very beginning of time in Israel, Moses stands at the very end of his life, and he reiterates this yet again. We can actually read this set of rules in a couple of different ways. And after the death of Moses, they're reiterated by Joshua. The rules of, if you will, I will. If you do this, I will do this. If you do these things, then you will have my safety. You will have my security. If you don't do these things, then you will not have my safety and my security. This has been the way that it's been throughout time. God is a very ordered God, and He writes out what He wants for us to do. So when we talk about the rules, these aren't rules made up by us. This is God saying, if you will, I will. You have to obey me. You have to live this way. You have to do these things, or to worship me. You have to honor me. And then I will offer you peace, protection, and provision. David says this when he says, He's my rock, my fortress, my deliverer, my God, in whom will I trust. He's worthy to be praised because of all these things. Because I lived a life, because I served Him in the way that I was supposed to serve Him, because I worshiped Him, because I did what I was supposed to do when I cried out for help. Sure, I had a time of trouble. Sure, I had a time of the enemy attacking, and it seemed like the enemy was winning. I understand these things. David says, I understand that's what happened, but because I'd lived the way that I lived, when I cried unto the Lord, then He thunders from the heaven. He sends out His voice, the hailstones, the coals of fire. That's all His protection. David says, I live in that life. Now, I realize that physically I wouldn't have been one of the ones that was living in the fort if I would have lived out in the old Western times. I realize that's not me. I probably would have been the guy living out on the wild frontier. I would have headed west in my Constantinaga wagon, and through the wife and children would all died of dysentery on the Oregon Trail on the way there, or whatever would have happened. And so that would have probably been where I was at. But spiritually, that's not where I want to be. Spiritually, I want to live in that place of safety. I want to live in that place of security. I want to live in that place of, I know who my God is. I know who my rock is. I know who my fortress is. I know who my deliverer is. David says, I love thee, O Lord, my strength. The Lord is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer, my God, my strength, in whom I will trust, my buckler, the horn of my salvation, and my high tower. I will call upon the Lord, who is worthy to be praised. So shall I be saved from mine enemies. He's my rock. David says there's lots of things to a lot of people, but He's my rock. David says He's my fortress and my high tower. This is such as it can be in our life, that we can have that personal relationship. Sure, He can be a lot of things to a lot of other people. I'm always encouraged, amen, by the testimonies that I hear. Having grown up in church, and as I like to say, there's teeth marks all over South Alabama where I chewed on church pews growing up. But there's a lot to be said when I can able to say that He's my rock, my fortress, my deliverer. There's been times in my life that I've made that call for myself, and there's very distinct times that I remember making that call for myself, and He became my rock and my fortress, my deliverer. Sure, it's nice to be able to call the pastor. It's nice to be able to call for the assembly and to call for prayer. But if you've ever been in that place where you've had to call for yourself, that you've had to make that call for yourself, there's not enough time to call for somebody else. I need God now, whether it's late at night and it's too late to make a polite phone call, and it's too late to wake the pastor up, and I don't want to make the phone call, but I need the Lord to help me right now. It's my sick family. It's my sick child. It's my sick spouse. It's the things that I need the Lord, or the troubles that are on my mind that are keeping me awake. Those troubles that are there. David says that we can have that relationship where He is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer, that He can be ours. He doesn't have to just be a story that we hear. He doesn't have to be just a story that we think about. Surely, now in the time frame that we are, that's really all that it is. When we talk about forts and castles and all the rest of those are just all stories. If you're a little bit of a history buff, you like to go imagining, and you go stand, and you go stand on the fort and say, well, I wonder what this looked like as we overlook the Barren Sea and overlook the ocean, and you ignore this guy and his powerboat and this guy and his sailboat and that guy out there fishing, and you think about how time was way back in the winds 100, 150, 200 years ago, when you stared out at a vast empty see, and you didn't know what was on the other side, and you didn't know what was behind you, and you stood there on that rock, and you realized that this was where I would want to be, inside this fortress. This is where I'd want to be. If something was bad going on, I'd want to be inside these walls to have a little bit of safety, to have a little bit of security. Certainly now, those times are all different. Before I went to bed last night, I looked at the weather and said, oh, look, it's going to rain tomorrow. Imagine living in a time when you didn't have that. Many of us are maybe old enough to have experienced that, when you didn't know what the weather was going to be tomorrow besides the best guess from the weatherman. Now you open your phone up and you can see the red and the yellows and the greens coming this way, and you can even hit fast forward and see what it's going to be when it's time to leave to go to church in the morning, whether you're going to get wet and get your umbrella even though it's still the night before. They have that future radar that you can look and see, and we can pull up the map and spin it around and look to see, as we can look through and see what is over the next hill, what is over there, what is coming. We can look to see, many of us, you can pull up your phone. I can look to see what's going on at the house and look at the cameras and see what's going on. But if we can take ourselves back to a time frame when you did not have any of that we could live inside that fortress in the middle of everything that's going on, that's where I want it to be. That's where I want it to live. We can live our life that we're in a place much like the psalmist. Once again, David says in Psalms chapter 4 and verse 8, I will both lay me down in peace and sleep, for thou, Lord, only makest me dwell in safety. Such is the place that we can be. We can live a life that we're in a place of peace, protection, and provision, and safety from the Lord. Good to be here this morning.